Queering Our Analysis of Sex Work, Laying Capitalism Bare by C.B. Dering. From the book Queering Anarchism by C.B. Dering, J. Rogue, Deric Shannon, and Abbey Volcano. This text retrieved from theanarchistlibrary.org. Sex work is a broad term that encompasses an unimaginably large group of people engaging in diverse labor. For the purposes of this article, the term sex work will be used to examine individuals receiving benefit or support from the trading of sex acts. Reproductive labor, housework, child rearing, etc., has been argued to be a part of the sex industry. However, it is not deeply explored in this piece. Stephanie Groman addresses reproductive labor in another article in this collection. The purpose of this piece is not to be a focused argument, so much as it is an exploration of queering and analysis of sex work. We must include sex work in an anarchist analysis because so often sex work has been treated as an exception to the rule. Every other aspect of labor and social experience has found itself under the anarchist magnifying glass, leaving the issue of sex work to be fought over by feminists, the religious community, and the non-governmental organization complex. Organizing alongside sex workers cannot simply be an afterthought or a subject too tough to engage. To queer our analysis of sex work, we must move beyond a paternalistic reaction to the thought of sex acts for sale and engage in organizing with sex workers globally. Sex work is a unique intersection between sex and labor, existing entirely neither in the personal nor political realm. The interconnectedness between economics and society within capitalism is complex. How can we argue that one form of sex is actually outside of capitalism's control? Are sex workers more subservient to capitalism than house spouses, or any sexual encounter? It's a dangerous path to tread to assume that some are more influenced by capitalism than others. Sex is not necessarily freely had when money is absent. Patriarchy is pervasive, and while some manifestations may be more visible, they are not necessarily more oppressive. Social structures reflect the dominant narrative of the culture within which they exist. The nuclear family, for example, perpetuates capitalism. Sex work is considered by many to be a primary threat to the nuclear family. There are generally two major theoretical strains fighting for prostitution abolition. One stems from the religious right, seeing sex work as a threat to modesty, chastity, and the moral fabric of society. They are fighting to preserve a heterosexual nuclear family while upholding a firmly heterosexist structure. A queer analysis allows us to envision the sex industry as something other than a threat to marriage and modern fidelity. The anarchist lens allows us to view sex work as something that does not exist within a vacuum, but another sector of capitalist industry. The second opposition strain tends to originate on the left, but borrows plenty from conservative perspectives. This objection sees sex work as a threat to the overall freedom of women by explicitly putting a price on sex. This assumption also manifests as seeing poor people incapable of immediate agency, unable to consent to sex work because of their economic context. We will examine both of these strains and their overall effect on the sexual and economic freedom of all people. As a queer, anarchist, communist sex worker, I wish to assist in moving the conversation and action forward without leaving any of my praxis behind. Both the right and left objections to sex work focus the argument about its effect explicitly on women, while either willfully or ignorantly ignoring the experiences of queer people and men. This article is not intended to explore or argue for the viability of the exchange of sex for other services in a post-revolutionary context. Any form of alienated labor is incompatible within an anarchist communist society. However, the struggle for the empowerment and self-representation of sex workers does not preclude the fight to end involuntary labor. I have no intention of speaking for anyone else or their experiences in the industry, but rather to explore what we can learn from this labor. Sex workers must be allowed and supported as individuals to define their own narrative, and not pimped by either the right or the left to further a political agenda. Scarcity sexuality and sacred sexuality. The underlying tendency to see human sexuality as the most sacred intrinsic aspect of ourselves is expressed often when speaking of sex work. It is assumed that our genders and sexuality are intrinsically born into us, rather than something that is nurtured and influenced. With these assumptions, a sex act alienated from us as labor becomes a grave infraction against what it means to be a human. There are two aspects to this. To perform a sex act for money somehow diminishes the overall value of our sexuality, considering it a non-renewable resource, and that other forms of labor alienation aren't really as violent as what is perceived to exist for sex workers. There's a vast difference between a sex act and an individual's sexuality. The idea that there's a hierarchy of alienation, with sex work ranking as one of the highest, is untrue. This false dichotomy is created by liberal criticisms of capitalism rather than an analysis of anti-capitalism. The implication is that certain alienation is essentially worse than other forms of alienation, that there could be a more humane form of alienation and exploitation. A similar mistake is often made to justify small and local businesses as less exploitive or capitalistic, when in fact, the volume of a business does not determine if it is capitalistic or not. It is the model of surplus value and labor exploitation that defines a capitalist structure. Creating these hierarchies of alienation is problematic because it drastically alters our ability to discuss labor in any substantive way. Within capitalism, commodities are affected by the concept of scarcity. In this case, human sexuality is subject to the actual and fabricated ebbs and flows of resources and the overall demand for them. Sexuality is not something that is scarce in the world, and trading sex acts does not suddenly make it true. If scarcity of sex were true, the simple act of having more sex would reduce the overall amount available. It wouldn't matter if sex were sold, simply had for fun, obligation, or pleasure. Scarcity is a myth of capitalism used to manipulate our sense of need toward an object or resource. Sacred sexuality is the idea that our sexuality is intrinsically connected to something greater than ourselves. This implies the sexual act includes something or someone more than the 1, 2, 3, 4, or more individuals present in body. The most common examples would be a deity or religious figure. Sacred sexuality is a tool used to shame or manipulate people about the sex they have. Sex in this context cannot simply be acts between consenting people, but instead an ideal open to moral scrutiny. This moral scrutiny is ceaselessly subjective and globally reflects a myriad of different social norms. Sacred sexuality is a tool for sexual control hidden under the guise of sexual preservation. Sacred sexuality also greatly contributes to an idealized woman, chaste and heterosexual. This vision of women is ever present in the debate around sex work. Scarcity sexuality and sacred sexuality are interrelated, as they both serve to control people's bodies. Both of these concepts justify regulation, social and governmental, for a perceived greater good. These regulations may often appear to target only sex workers, but they extend much further. We should not be surprised that conservative perspectives embrace protecting intimate femininity, but when it happens within the radical left, it illustrates a glaring theoretical gap. This is problematic because it perpetuates the fallacy that a woman's, or really anyone's, worth is bound up in their sexuality and capacity for sex. Sex workers are not demeaning themselves on a basic human level any more than the rest of the working class. Focusing an argument exclusively on regulating women perceived as straight disregards that significant portions of those working within the sex industry are queer folks, trans folks, and men. Of course, not mutually exclusive. Women face a unique experience within the industry at the intersection of commerce and patriarchy. However, many other people experience intersectional oppressions within the industry. The narrative that non-trans women have a nearly identical experience to each other, but incomparable to other sex workers, demonstrates a specific agenda by those that peddle it. Many prostitution abolitionists argue that all those involved in the sex industry were forced to do so by pimps, live in slavery-like conditions, are addicted to drugs, and are riddled with STIs. While sensationally this is appealing, it is not an effective way to view a large group of workers. Statistics on entry into sex work are incredibly hard to come by, and tend to be swayed by those that collected them. However, there's a fair amount of evidence that pimping, at least in the United States, is not particularly prevalent. Sex workers are not so easily generalized, and while a variety of abuses happen in the sex industry, they are not unique to this industry. The idea that women globally cannot choose to work in the sex industry, but they can choose some other industry within capitalism, is offensive and condescending. It is as if their engagement in the sex industry illustrates some flaw or weakness. Sex workers are not revolutionary in their labor, but neither are they a threat to the fabric of society. Sex work is another form of exploited labor within capitalism. What makes it unique is what we can learn from seeing how labor is alienated. This process is intimate, but capitalism has mystified it within other sectors. Choice and capitalism. Anarchism precludes the belief that there cannot be a more humane form of capitalism. It is fundamentally in opposition to the concept that we can regulate an economic system based on ever-expanding profit and oppression. If we take this as a given, it is necessary to elevate our analysis of sex work. I have been asked countless times why I choose the sex industry. I answered that I no more chose sex work than I chose retail, tourism, or food service. We all have a spectrum of limited options to choose from. Why does the sex industry imply a personal identity to its workers? The implication is that some labor choices are more political than others. Another common question is, how could someone choose sex work if there were ample options of meaningful work? The reality is that for the working class, there are not ample options of meaningful work. Seemingly meaningful work may very well be code for non-alienated labor. With a solid analysis of capitalism, the term meaningful work has no basis within the current capitalist economy. Choice within capitalism is an illusion. These choices are only substantive in that one may be able to choose what brand of labor exploitation they prefer. For the vast majority of the working class, even that choice is non-existent. It is never an option to choose not to be exploited. The labor exchange of sex work is no different than that of any other industry. However, the way in which it is presented treats it as uniquely violent. Sex work exposes a significant contradiction within capitalism. We trade the labor in our bodies for a wage, while simultaneously supporting the creation of surplus value for the overall economy. This does not mean that it is more intimate than labor alienation in other sectors, but rather, it is one of the most transparent. Money exchanged is based on a perceived value of those individual services and the value of the benefits for the purchaser. Sex work illustrates how a capitalist economy values labor and determines the value of the laborers themselves. Workers are only worth the amount that they produce within capitalism. It is this visibility that strips the mysticism of capitalism away. The state and sex workers. Western conceptions of compulsory monogamy propel the idea that a two-person exclusive partnership is the human universal. Anything that moves individuals away from a two-person monogamous partnership is considered unnatural. This could be applied to either a person providing sexual services or their partner visiting a provider of sexual services. As anarchists, we should certainly be able to reject the idea of this human universal and clearly see who benefits from the nuclear family. The nuclear family is not the accidental result of urbanization and industrialization, but rather the most efficient way to reproduce laborers and profit. There is no state that imposes no regulation on the sex industry. State regulation follows the false wisdom that it is for the sex workers' own good. This is not to say that a completely unregulated market favors workers' rights or autonomy, but rather that these regulations must come from the workers themselves. The presumption seems to be that sex workers have no conception of what is good or safe for themselves. A prime example in the United States is the legalized prostitution in Nevada. If prostitutes choose to work at one of the legal brothels, they are required to stay on the compound unless accompanied by a chaperone. They undergo mandatory testing once a month, but if they are off the compound for more than 24 hours, they must submit to testing before returning to work. While sex workers spearheaded the movement for mandatory condom use in Nevada, they are still not given access to regulatory advisory board. What does the state have to gain from the regulation and criminalization of sex work? Regulation justifies further surveillance of poor people, people of color, and queer people. Of course, these are not mutually exclusive, who are the majority of sex workers globally. The criminalization of the sex industry continues to rationalize incredible violations of human rights around the world, all in the name of protecting sex workers. Many sex workers are placed in rehabilitation camps, where they are subjected to sexual assault and beatings by guards and staff. Incarceration seems to be the global universal in the rehabilitation of sex workers, for those classified as voluntary or forced sex workers. The dichotomy of forced versus voluntary sex work is highlighted in most regulation. Providing social and health services for those that are regarded as forced is given tantamount funding and support. However, it is almost impossible to find funding and support for voluntary sex workers. In particular, the U.S. will not fund any program that they consider to condone prostitution. There is no evidence that regulation is for sex workers' best interests. Regulation serves the purpose of furthering the divide between sex workers and ultimately impedes self-organizing. Reproductive labor, the labor that is done to produce new laborers and that allows wage earners to continue to work every day, is built into the state apparatus, particularly the unpaid labor of home workers. This labor includes the rearing of children, cooking of meals, and housework, but it also includes the sexual reproduction of the often male wage earner within a household. Sexual reproduction, not limited to child producing, remains invisible as labor, but is implicit in the structure. Sex work fundamentally upsets this balance by requiring money be exchanged for a finite amount of time, as opposed to a housewife or unwaged home worker who exchanges unlimited labor for an infinite amount of time without wage. The state relies on this unwaged reproductive labor in order to maintain civil order and the continuation of the nuclear family. Requiring a specific monetary exchange for sexual reproduction socially undermines the concept that it is available without reciprocation, that the sexual availability of women may not be a given. It has been argued that sex work sets a social precedent that the sexuality of women is always available if the price is right. However, sex work actually undermines the idea women are available for free, or that the purpose of women is labor reproduction. This is dangerous to the state apparatus because it shows a direct benefit to be reaped from free reproductive labor. Having children, reproducing the primary wage earner, and even sex may be done naturally. But these things are work. When the left gets into bed with abolitionists, these are the unintended consequences: the furthering of patriarchy through upholding the nuclear family. Queer intersections and sex worker intersections. A queer analysis of sex work frees us from the constraints of viewing it as a threat to marriage and workforce reproduction. This is certainly not meant to imply that fidelity is not important within a queer analysis, but sex work does not threaten an institution of fidelity. A queer analysis of sex work allows us to view sex in an unconventional way, where sex is not essentially degrading, private, or for love. There is a huge overlap between sex workers and queer folks. In particular, trans folks, often ignored by governments, NGOs, and industry abolitionists, make up a tremendous population in the sex industry. Female prostitutes that service male clients are not strictly heterosexual. Many identify as lesbians, bisexual, or queer. Male escorts may service male clients, but may regulate to female partners outside of work. The gender and sexual identity of sex workers is not necessarily reflected by the clients they have. This fluidity between personal and professional sexuality reflects a certain queerness to the sex industry that may not often be apparent. It is important to remember the difference between what is marketed and what is a reality for those on the inside. This performance may not be reflective of the individual sex worker, but rather a promotion tactic to attract clients. Socially, both queer folks and sex workers face similar stigma. The people they sleep with determine their entire identity. This is the assumption that gender and sexuality are intrinsic and fundamental, that they are static rather than transitory. As seen in the dominant treatment of other marginalized groups, the defining differences become the rationale for exclusion, violence, and discrimination. Queer, trans, and people of color in the sex industry disproportionately experience violence at the hands of the state and clients. Compounded intersecting oppressions are only drawn in starker contrast by the stigma around sex work. Ultimately, it is the stigma that sex workers face that is unique, not the nature of their work. Organizing with sex workers. The goal of organizing with sex workers should be to increase empowerment and self-representation. For many sex workers, it is a huge risk to speak publicly for fear of exposure to clients, police, and family. Do not assume that sex workers do not wish to speak for themselves. There are avenues that can limit dangerous exposure. It is still very controversial to organize with sex workers. Especially, the goal is not to get them out of the industry. A movement to improve conditions in the sex industry cannot originate from those that prioritize eliminating the industry over the autonomy of the workers themselves. There is a growing movement of sex workers acting publicly to better conditions within the industry. In a Western context, sex workers' rights are connected to other prominent anarchist projects, specifically around gentrification, anti-racism, anti-police brutality, and queer rights. Don't assume you know people's history. You may already know plenty of sex workers. Due to the stigma so often attached to this sector of industry, many folks may never disclose, nor feel compelled to, if they have worked in the sex industry. Individual sex workers should not be expected to be accountable for the discomfort of others' disagreement with the sex industry. Sex workers are often the most vocal about the problems within the industry and are intimately familiar with possible solutions and strategies. It is a myth that sex workers are the primary apologists for the industry. When the criticisms come from non-sex workers, it should not be surprising that those currently or formerly in the industry may react offensively. It has been our livelihood, and regardless of our negative experiences, they are still our experiences. It has been said that there is no room within anarchism for sex work, that to fight for improvement in the industry will only extend its life. There is no room in post-revolutionary society for any alienated labor. That does not mean that we can simply discount the industries we find problematic now. It's all of us or none of us. Conclusion. We do not live in a world so easily divided by participation or withdrawal from capitalism. Our experiences are intersectional and intertwined. There is no essential sex worker experience, just as there is no essential queer experience. As anarchists and radicals, we can begin to critically examine the common intersections. Those who sell sex directly for goods and services are not more entrenched in capitalism than those who sell their labor behind a restaurant counter or in a factory. This is obscured by capitalism in order to maintain a systematic ideal of freedom, sex, and economics. Capitalism's oppression of workers is threatened by the naked truth shown by sex work. We must not be satiated by these false ideas of freedom and imagined choice. We must continue to push a radical analysis when examining gender and sexuality, and reject the convenient moral fallbacks that have plagued the left. Moral fortitudes that limit real freedom serve no greater good. To queer our analysis, we must not be satisfied with comfortable or quiet expression, but instead continue to fight loudly for inclusion and self-representation, not only with the usual suspects, but also with those so often rendered invisible.